Picture this. It's 2 a.m. in London, 1350. You're walking home through pitch-black streets after an evening at the tavern. Suddenly, you hear footsteps behind you, heavy boots on cobblestone. Then a voice cuts through the darkness. Who goes there? State your business. You freeze, because that voice belongs to a member of the night watch, and if you don't have a damn good reason for being out after curfew, you're spending the night in jail. Welcome to medieval policing. No police cars, no radios, no forensics labs, no DNA evidence. Just ordinary citizens armed with clubs, patrolling dark streets, trying to keep order in cities that could erupt into chaos at any moment. And here's what's going to blow your mind. This system actually worked. For centuries, cities with populations of tens of thousands maintained order using methods that would seem almost primitive by modern standards. But dig deeper, and you'll find a sophisticated system of laws, enforcement, and community participation that laid the groundwork for modern policing. So how did they do it? How did medieval cities keep the peace when there were no professional police forces? How did they investigate crimes without modern technology? And what happened if you broke the law in a world where justice was swift, brutal, and very, very public? Today, I'm taking you inside the world of medieval law enforcement. We're going to walk the night watch patrol, sit in on medieval court proceedings, witness punishments that will make your stomach turn, and discover that medieval policing was far more organized and effective than you ever imagined. Let's start with the foundation of medieval law enforcement, the night watch. The year is 1285. King Edward I of England has just passed the Statute of Winchester, one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of policing. This law fundamentally reorganized how English cities maintained order, and its influence spread across Europe. Here's what the statute required. Every town had to establish a night watch consisting of local men who would patrol the streets from sunset to sunrise. Not volunteers, not paid professionals, just regular guys doing their civic duty on a rotating basis. And this wasn't optional. If you were an able-bodied man between 15 and 60 living in a town, you were going on watch duty. Period. The statute was crystal clear. In every city 6 men shall keep watch at every gate. In every borough 12 men. In every town 6 or 4, according to the number of inhabitants. Think about that for a second. Medieval cities essentially had a mandatory draft for law enforcement. Your turn came up? Too bad. You're patrolling the streets tonight with a lantern, a club, and probably a severe lack of sleep. But why the night specifically? Why not patrol during the day? The answer is simple. Medieval cities were terrifying at night. There was no street lighting except what the watch carried. No windows in most buildings, just wooden shutters. When the sun went down, cities became labyrinths of absolute darkness, broken only by scattered torches and lanterns. And in that darkness, thieves, cut purses, burglars, drunks looking for fights, fires waiting to start. All the chaos and crime that humans are capable of, amplified by the cover of night. The day had its own law enforcement, we'll get to that, but night was when cities were most vulnerable. So that's when the watch took over. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical night watch patrol actually looked like. You're a baker in 14th century York. It's Tuesday night, which means it's your turn on the watch. You close up shop at sunset, grab a quick meal, and then head to the watch station at the city gate. There you meet 5 other men from your neighborhood: a blacksmith, a carpenter, a wool merchant, and 2 laborers. The constable, more on him in a minute, gives you your assignments. You and the blacksmith are taking the eastern quarter of the city. Your equipment: each of you gets a wooden staff about 5 feet long, similar to a walking stick but heavier. One of you carries a lantern with a candle inside. That's it. That's your gear for patrolling dark medieval streets. Your shift runs from 9 p.m. until dawn. That's roughly 9 hours of walking through cold, dark streets, watching for trouble. What exactly are you watching for? The constable's instructions are clear. First, enforce the curfew. Anyone out after 9 p.m. without legitimate business is suspicious. Stop them, question them, and if their excuse doesn't hold up, arrest them. The penalty for breaking curfew could range from a fine to a night in the stocks to actual jail time, depending on the city's bylaws. Second, watch for fires. This is actually your most important job. Medieval cities were tinderboxes, wooden buildings packed close together, open flames for cooking and heat, thatched roofs. A single unattended fire could burn down entire neighborhoods. If you see smoke or flames, you don't fight it yourself. You raise the hue and cry, literally start shouting "Fire! Fire!" to wake the neighborhood and get help. Third, watch for crimes in progress. Burglaries, assaults, theft. If you witness a crime, you're expected to intervene. Not chase down criminals alone. That's dangerous and stupid. But raise the hue and cry and get help from other watchmen and citizens. Fourth, check that businesses are properly secured. Walk past shops and make sure doors are locked, shutters are closed. A surprising amount of theft happened because people just forgot to secure their premises. Fifth, break up disturbances. Drunks fighting outside taverns, domestic disputes that spill into the streets, rowdy apprentices causing trouble. Your job is to restore order, not necessarily make arrests. As you walk your patrol route, you stop every hour or so at designated spots where you're supposed to call out the time and the weather. 10 o'clock and all's well, or 11 o'clock and raining. This serves 2 purposes. It lets citizens know the watch is active, and it helps you coordinate with other watch groups patrolling nearby areas. Around midnight, you encounter your first real challenge. You hear shouting from a tavern, followed by the crash of breaking pottery. You and your partner approach cautiously. Through the window, you see 2 men fighting, throwing punches while others try to pull them apart. You don't go in swinging. Instead, you bang your staff on the door and announce yourself, "City Watch, open up." The fighting stops. The tavern keeper comes to the door, apologizing profusely. He promises to handle it and get everyone out. You don't arrest anyone. There's no serious injury, no property damage beyond some broken cups. But you make a note of which tavern it was and warn the keeper that if it happens again, there will be consequences. This is actually how most of your night goes. Not dramatic chases or sword fights, but checking doors, questioning suspicious people, and handling minor disturbances. It's boring, cold, and exhausting, but it's also essential. Because your presence, the knowledge that someone is watching, is what keeps the city from descending into chaos. Now, here's a question you might be asking. If these were just regular citizens doing mandatory service, How effective could they really be? The answer might surprise you. They were surprisingly effective for several reasons. First, local knowledge. You weren't a stranger patrolling unfamiliar streets. You lived in this neighborhood. You knew who belonged here and who didn't. You knew which houses had elderly residents who might need checking on. You knew which alleys were safe shortcuts and which ones to avoid. This local knowledge was invaluable. Second, community accountability. Everyone knew everyone in medieval cities. If you slacked off on your watch duty, your neighbors would know. And since they'd be relying on you to watch their property and safety, there was social pressure to do a good job. Third, it was actually a pretty smart system. By rotating duties among all able-bodied men, the burden was shared. No one had to do it every night. Most men served maybe 1 or 2 nights per month, which was manageable alongside their regular work. But, and this is important, the night watch wasn't the only form of law enforcement in medieval cities. During the day, a different system took over. Enter the constable. If the night watch was the foot soldiers of medieval policing, the constable was the officer in charge. This was an official position, usually appointed by the city authorities or elected by the local community, and it came with real power. The constable's job was to oversee law enforcement in his district. In large cities like London or Paris, there might be dozens of constables, each responsible for a specific ward or neighborhood. In smaller towns, one constable might handle the entire settlement. What exactly did a constable do? Let's break it down. First, he organized and supervised the night watch. He assigned patrol routes, made sure people showed up for their shifts, investigated complaints about watchmen not doing their jobs, and generally kept the whole system running. Second, he investigated crimes. When something serious happened, murder, major theft, assault, the constable was the one who conducted the investigation. He'd interview witnesses, examine evidence, track down suspects. Not with modern forensic tools, obviously, but through questioning, observation, and a lot of legwork. Third, he made arrests. The constable had the legal authority to arrest anyone suspected of a crime and hold them for trial. He could also enter private property to search for stolen goods or fugitives, though this power had limits depending on local laws. Fourth, he enforced court orders. If the local court sentenced someone to the stocks or ordered property seized, the constable was the one who carried it out. Fifth, and this is fascinating, he served as a kind of mediator for minor disputes. 2 neighbors arguing about property boundaries? The constable might step in and broker a settlement before it escalated to court. This role as community problem solver was actually a huge part of the job. Constables were usually unpaid or received only a small stipend. Like the watch, this was considered civic duty. But unlike the rotating watch duty, being a constable was a year-long commitment and required significant time and effort. So who became constables? Generally, respectable citizens with some standing in the community. Often craftsmen, merchants, or minor officials. Men who had enough social status to command respect but weren't so wealthy or powerful that they'd see the job as beneath them. In London in the 1340s, for example, we have records of constables who were bakers, weavers, tailors, and vintners. Solid middle-class citizens who took on this responsibility as part of their civic obligations. But here's where it gets interesting. Constables had a lot of discretion in how they did their jobs. There was no standardized training, no police academy, no procedures manual. Each constable learned on the job and developed their own methods. This meant the quality of law enforcement could vary wildly. A good constable, smart, fair, energetic, could keep his district running smoothly. A lazy or corrupt constable could let crime spiral out of control while lining his own pockets with bribes. And corruption was absolutely a problem. Constables were in the perfect position to abuse their power. They could shake down businesses, take bribes to ignore crimes, or use their authority to settle personal grudges. Medieval cities constantly struggled with this, passing ordinances and implementing oversight to try to keep constables honest. Now, you might be wondering, what laws were these constables and watchmen actually enforcing? What was illegal in a medieval city? The answer is a lot. Medieval cities had extensive legal codes covering everything from major crimes to incredibly petty offenses. Let me give you some examples from 14th century London's bylaws. Murder, obviously, was illegal and punishable by hanging. So was theft above a certain value, usually 12 pence, which was about 3 days' wages for a laborer. Steal more than that and you could hang. Assault was illegal, with punishments ranging from fines to imprisonment to mutilation, depending on severity. If you drew blood in a fight, that was considered more serious than just throwing punches. Burglary, breaking into someone's property with intent to steal, was a capital crime. The distinction between burglary and simple theft mattered a lot, because burglary implied premeditation and violation of someone's home. But then there were the really specific regulations. In London, you couldn't throw waste into the streets, fine 2 shillings, let your pigs roam freely, fine. For pence per pig, bake underweight bread, punishment. Being dragged through the streets on a sledge with a bad loaf hung around your neck, water down ale, punishment. The stocks, operate a brothel, punishment. Public shaming, fine and banishment. Practice trades without proper guild membership, fine. Confiscation of goods. The cities also had extensive fire safety regulations. You had to cover your cooking fire before bed. You couldn't have a thatched roof in certain neighborhoods. You had to keep a bucket of water outside your door. Breaking these rules could result in serious fines, because fire was such an existential threat. And then there was curfew. This deserves special attention because it was one of the most important and most frequently enforced laws. Curfew, the word comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. Originally referred to the evening bell that signaled people to cover their cooking fires and go to bed. But it evolved into a broader rule. After a certain hour, usually around 9 p.m., everyone was supposed to be indoors unless they had legitimate business. Who had legitimate business? Travelers arriving late, midwives going to a birth, physicians tending to the sick, night soil collectors doing their rounds. You needed a good excuse to be out after curfew. The reasoning was partly about fire safety. People asleep in their homes weren't tending open flames that might start a blaze. But it was also about crime prevention. Empty streets meant anyone out and about was likely up to no good. Enforcing curfew was one of the night watch's primary jobs. If they found you out after hours, they'd demand an explanation. If it didn't satisfy them, you were arrested and held until morning, when you'd face the constable or local court. What was punishment like if you broke curfew? For a first offense, usually a fine. Maybe a night in jail. For repeat offenders, it could escalate to time in the stocks or pillory. The stocks and pillory, by the way, were central to medieval punishment. These weren't just quaint historical curiosities. They were serious, humiliating punishments used constantly. The stocks held your feet, forcing you to sit. The pillory held your head and hands, forcing you to stand. In either case, you'd be locked in place in a public square for hours or even days, exposed to the elements and public ridicule. And medieval crowds did not hold back. People would throw rotten food, manure, dead animals, rocks. They'd spit on you, mock you, maybe even assault you physically. Guards were supposed to prevent serious violence, but a certain amount of abuse was considered part of the punishment. For crimes like selling spoiled food or watering down ale, you might spend a day in the stocks with your offense written on a sign above your head. The humiliation was the point, public shaming to discourage others from similar crimes. For more serious crimes, punishments got much harsher. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Forgers might have their ears cropped. Perjurers might have their tongues cut out. And for the most serious crimes, murder, treason, arson, execution was common. Public executions weren't just about punishment. They were theater. Hangings drew huge crowds. They were scheduled on market days to maximize attendance. The condemned might give a speech, a priest would pray for their soul, and then the sentence would be carried out. It was brutal, bloody, and very effective as a deterrent. Medieval justice operated on the principle that punishment should be visible, public, and memorable. But let's get back to the investigation side of things. How did medieval constables actually solve crimes without modern tools? The answer is very differently than we do today, but more cleverly than you might think. Take theft, one of the most common crimes. Let's say a merchant reports that someone broke into his shop overnight and stole cloth worth 20 shillings. How would a constable investigate? First, he'd examine the scene. Look for signs of forced entry. Check if anything else was taken or disturbed. Ask the merchant when he last saw the goods and who knew he had them. Second, he'd question neighbors. Did anyone see or hear anything suspicious? Any strangers in the area? Any former employees with grudges? Third, and this is key, he'd watch the markets. Stolen goods had to be sold somewhere, and constables knew the local markets intimately. A sudden appearance of cloth matching the description? That's your lead. Fourth, he'd rely on informants. Medieval cities had their share of criminals, and constables cultivated relationships with these underworld figures. Information about who was fencing stolen goods, who was planning crimes, who was hiding fugitives. This network of informants was crucial. Fifth, he'd use the hue and cry system. This ancient practice required anyone who witnessed a crime to raise a loud alarm, literally shouting, "Stop thief," or similar. Everyone within earshot was legally obligated to join the pursuit. Fail to do so, and you could be fined for not helping. If the suspect was caught in the hue and cry, they could be immediately taken to the constable. If the pursuit crossed into another district or outside the city, neighboring areas were required to join the chase. This system actually worked surprisingly well for catching criminals in the act or shortly after. The whole community became law enforcement. For murder investigations, constables used some surprisingly sophisticated techniques. They'd view the body carefully, noting wounds and trying to determine the cause of death. They'd interview anyone who saw the victim before death. They'd trace the victim's movements to find the last person who saw them alive. They'd also look for motive. who benefited from the victim's death, who had grievances against them. Medieval investigators understood that most murders weren't random, they were personal. Physical evidence was collected too, though without modern forensics. A bloody weapon found at the scene, torn cloth matching a suspect's clothing, footprints in mud. These could all be presented as evidence. But here's where medieval justice gets really interesting: the trial process. In many medieval cities, trials weren't conducted by judges and lawyers like today. Instead, they used juries of local citizens. But not quite like modern juries. For serious crimes, you'd first face an inquest jury of 12 to 24 citizens who would hear the evidence and decide if there was enough to proceed to trial. If they said yes, you'd then face a trial jury of 12 citizens who would determine guilt or innocence. These weren't randomly selected citizens. They were often people from your own neighborhood who knew you and your reputation. This cut both ways. They might be sympathetic to you, or they might already think you were guilty based on your past behavior. Evidence standards were loose. Witness testimony was accepted even if it was hearsay. Circumstantial evidence could convict. And your own reputation mattered enormously. If you were known as a troublemaker, the jury was more likely to believe you were guilty. There was no innocent until proven guilty in the modern sense. If you were accused and arrested, there was already a presumption of guilt. The trial was your chance to overcome that presumption, but the burden was on you. And here's something wild. In some cases, if the evidence was unclear, they'd use trial by ordeal. The accused would be subjected to some painful test, carrying a hot iron bar, plunging their hand into boiling water, being thrown into water to see if they floated, and God was expected to reveal the truth through the outcome. By the 14th century, trial by ordeal was dying out, banned by the Church in 1215. But it shows how medieval justice operated on very different principles than modern law. Now, let me tell you about a specific case that illustrates how this all worked in practice. In 1322, in London, a merchant named John de Preston was found stabbed to death in an alley near Cheapside. The constable of that ward, a vintner named Thomas Romaine, was called to investigate. Romaine examined the body and found 7 stab wounds, suggesting a frenzied attack. He interviewed neighbors, who reported hearing shouting around midnight, but couldn't identify the voices. Here's where it gets interesting. Romaine knew that de Preston had recently had a public argument with a rival merchant over a business deal gone wrong. He brought in this rival for questioning. The rival had an alibi. He was at a dinner party with several reputable witnesses who vouched for him. Dead end. But then Romaine got a break. An informant told him that a young apprentice had been seen selling a knife with blood on it at the market. The knife matched the wounds on the body. Romaine tracked down the apprentice, who panicked and confessed. Turns out he was deep in gambling debts and had decided to rob someone. He'd hidden in the alley waiting for a mark. De Preston happened by, and when the merchant resisted, the apprentice panicked and stabbed him repeatedly. The apprentice was arrested, tried before a jury of London citizens, found guilty, and hanged within a week of the murder. Swift justice. This case shows several things: the constable's investigative work, the use of informants, the importance of physical evidence, and the speed of medieval justice once guilt was established. But not all cases were solved. Medieval crime clearance rates were probably pretty low, especially for property crimes where there were no witnesses and the goods were quickly sold. What constables and the watch could do effectively was maintain general order. Their presence deterred casual crime. Their local knowledge helped them spot suspicious activity. And the web of community surveillance, everyone watching everyone else, made it harder to get away with things. Let's talk about the role of the church in all this, because religion wasn't separate from law enforcement in medieval cities, it was integral. First, churches offered sanctuary. If you committed a crime and made it to a church before being caught, you could claim sanctuary, protection from arrest. You'd have to confess your crime to a priest and agree to leave the kingdom within 40 days. But you couldn't be taken by force from consecrated ground. This wasn't just tradition. It was legally recognized. Constables who violated sanctuary could be excommunicated and face serious legal consequences. Second, the church ran its own courts for certain offenses. Moral crimes like adultery, blasphemy, or failing to attend church fell under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Church courts couldn't impose death sentences, but they could excommunicate you, fine you, or order public penance. Third, clergy themselves were often exempt from secular justice. If a priest committed a crime, he'd usually be tried in a church court, which tended to be more lenient. This benefit of clergy was widely abused. People learned to read just enough Latin to claim clerical status and avoid harsh punishments. Fourth, the church was a source of moral authority that backed up secular law enforcement. Priests preached about the importance of obeying laws and authorities. They threatened divine punishment for crimes. This religious reinforcement made people more likely to comply with earthly laws. Fifth, church bells marked time and signaled alarms. The curfew bell told people to go home. The alarm bell warned of fire or invasion. These bells were essential infrastructure for urban order. The church and secular authorities weren't always aligned, of course. Conflicts over jurisdiction, sanctuary violations, and the behavior of clergy created ongoing tensions. But in general, they worked together to maintain order. Now, all of this, the watch, the constables, the courts, the punishments, existed in a relatively stable environment. But what happened when crisis hit? Let me tell you about how medieval policing coped with the Black Death. When plague struck a city, the entire law enforcement system came under incredible strain. The death toll was staggering. In some cities, 40 to 50 of the population died within months. This created immediate problems. The night watch depended on mandatory service from local men. But if half your men were dead or sick, who patrolled the streets? In many cities, the watch system partially collapsed. Patrols became sporadic or stopped altogether. Crime spiked. Looters broke into homes of the dead. Con artists sold fake plague cures. Price gougers exploited desperate people. But cities also had to enforce new emergency measures. Plague houses were marked with red crosses to warn people away. The sick were quarantined, sometimes by force. Bodies had to be collected and buried quickly to prevent further spread. Who enforced these measures? Often the constables and remaining watchmen, putting themselves at enormous risk of infection. Some cities hired plague guards. Men paid to stand outside quarantined houses and make sure no one went in or out. This was one of the first examples of paid, professional law enforcement in medieval Europe, born out of desperate necessity. The plague also disrupted the court system. Juries couldn't meet safely. Trials were postponed. Prisons became death traps as plague spread among packed inmates. In the aftermath, labor shortages led to new crimes. Laborers demanded higher wages, violating laws that tried to keep wages fixed. People abandoned land they'd inherited, causing property disputes. The whole social order was shaken. Medieval law enforcement adapted slowly and imperfectly, but it survived, which itself is remarkable. As we move into the 15th century, we start to see the first steps toward professional policing. Some Italian cities began hiring armed guards, basically mercenaries, to supplement the watch. These were paid professionals who served year-round, not citizens doing occasional duty. France developed the maréchaussée, a mounted police force initially focused on rural areas, but eventually operating in cities too. These were career lawmen trained and equipped by the state. In England, parish constables, the position we've been discussing, became more professionalized. While still technically unpaid civic positions, constables received more formal authority, better support, and clearer procedures. The Spanish created the Santa Hermandad, a law enforcement organization with jurisdiction across different territories. They had uniforms, standardized weapons, and central command. These developments laid the groundwork for modern policing. But they didn't replace the older systems overnight. Well into the 17th and 18th centuries, many cities still relied primarily on citizen watch systems. In fact, when London finally created the Metropolitan Police in 1829, often considered the first modern police force, they were explicitly rejecting the older watch system that had existed for over 500 years. So what can we learn from medieval policing? First, law enforcement doesn't require high technology to be effective. Medieval cities maintained order through community participation, local knowledge, and visible presence. These principles still matter today. Second, the integration of law enforcement into the community. Having citizens serve as watchmen and constables created accountability. These weren't outsiders imposing order. These were neighbors policing neighbors. Third, swift and public justice served as a powerful deterrent. Modern justice is often slow and invisible. Medieval justice was fast and very, very visible. Both approaches have trade-offs. Fourth, flexibility mattered. Medieval cities faced different challenges: plague, war, fire, flood, and their law enforcement systems had to adapt quickly. The ability to mobilize the whole community through systems like the hue and cry gave them resilience. Fifth, no system is perfect. Medieval policing had serious flaws: corruption, brutality, inequality before the law, reliance on confession extracted through torture in some places. We shouldn't romanticize it, but we also shouldn't dismiss it as primitive or ineffective. For centuries, this system kept cities functioning, maintained basic order, and protected citizens from chaos. It evolved, adapted, and eventually transformed into the policing systems we know today. The night watchman walking dark streets with his lantern and staff was more than just a guard. He was a neighbor, a citizen doing his duty, a human link in a chain of community responsibility that stretched across his city. And when you understand that, you understand something fundamental about how human societies organize themselves to maintain order and safety. So the next time you see a police officer on patrol, remember, They're the distant descendants of those medieval watchmen. The tools have changed, the training has improved, the legal framework has evolved. But the basic mission, keeping the peace, preventing crime, protecting the community, that's remained constant for over 1,000 years. From the night watch to the beat cop, it's the same idea. Someone has to walk the streets and stand between order and chaos. Someone has to answer when trouble calls. Medieval cities figured that out. And their solution, for all its flaws, worked well enough to last half a millennium. That's not primitive. That's pretty damn impressive. Thanks for joining me on this journey through medieval law enforcement. If this changed how you think about policing, history, or how communities maintain order, drop a comment below. What surprised you most? What would you have done differently? And if you want to dive deeper into medieval history, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, we've only scratched the surface of how wild, weird, and surprisingly sophisticated the medieval world really was. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go check if my doors are locked. Old habits die hard.